Okay, today we're going to make a program to test whether or not a number of strings in a file are palindromes. And you can see I've already set up my project. I have a nice little skeleton here. And I've also added to this project just by going like this, new file. I've added a file called possible pals, which has a bunch of palindromes. So these are palindromes, but this, of course, is not a palindrome. This is a palindrome, and you'll notice here that it's a palindrome if you don't include spaces and punctuation, and that's something that we're going to handle in our program. And this is a palindrome, this is not, this is. Okay, so let's get started. So let me actually include just a couple other of our standard libraries. So we're going to include the scanner. Also going to import java.io.star, and this is what we're going to use for our file access to read in our palindrome strings from our text file here. And just one other small thing about JavaDoc, since I haven't talked about it that much. In this program, we're going to use multiple functions, and you can see if you click here this JavaDoc tab, and you just saw that little pop-up. You can see the documentation that's produced by our comment here. So if you want to look at that, you can do that, and sometimes that's useful to make sure you have the formatting right and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's set some things up here. So we're first going to just define where our candidate palindromes are stored. One per line. Okay? Now, of course, the text file can be called anything, but I'm just calling it possiblepals.txt. Now, we could obviously prompt the user for this, have them type that in, but it's just, that's sort of trivial, and hopefully that's, you know how to do that by now if you wanted to. This is just a little bit easier for now. Because this is a little more complicated project, we're going to start using methods, separate methods, meaning we're going, instead of putting all of our code in public static void main, we're going to split it up. And this is often useful. This is often more efficient, sort of space-wise. And even when it's not, it's really helpful conceptually because it makes things simpler at a high level. So let me just write in a few comments here to sort of flesh out what we're going to do, and then we'll build the functions out of that. So first we're going to get the array of possible palindromes. So we're going to have basically right here we're gonna call a function to get this array. It's going to be an array of strings. We're going to call it pospals, and we're going to finish this later. Okay, and actually, why don't I just do this? So we're going to say this equals. We're going to have a function called read pals file, and we're going to pass it that, and that's going to return a string array. Okay. Actually, why don't I even just... Eclipse is going to complain because it doesn't have this method, but we will fill that in a little bit. Okay, so imagine we've sort of magically read in all of these palindromes in this file. Now we need to process them, and so we're going to do that just in a standard loop. And you'll notice that these arrays have a length property, which we're going to make use of. It tells us how long it is. It's not C, it's P. Okay. So now, so we basically what we do for each possible palindrome. That's no good. There we go. For each possible palindrome, we're going to print it out, and then we're going to print out a message of whether it is or is not a palindrome. So this is going to involve a function called isPalindrome. Okay, so you'll notice that Eclipse is complaining and say, hey, you don't have this function called isPalindrome. And that's true, we haven't built it yet. But so let's go. Actually, so one thing is, technically in Java, this is called a method. But often in other languages, it's called a function, and the names mean the same thing. But sometimes if I accidentally say function, it's because I'm thinking in a different language. So function, method, it's the same thing, and just it's technically called a method in Java. Okay, so let's go build these methods. So this is basically our program, and you'll notice what defining these methods separately is it allows us to abstract away a lot of our code that's important, but is not vital to the sort of higher level processing of our code here. And so here this is going to involve a little bit of reading in the file and things like that, but we're not going to worry about it because here it's just high level. And same here, we're not going to worry exactly how we test whether it's a palindrome. We just have a method that gives us a sort of yes or no or true or false answer. Okay, so let's make another method, and this method. So we're going to make our Java doc here. Actually, let me write the thing. So it's going to be private, and don't worry quite yet what the difference between public and private is. We're going to get to that in a few more projects when we talk about object-oriented programming. But it's going to be static. Again, don't worry too much what that is yet, but it's going to return an array of strings, and we're going to call it read pals file, and it takes in a file path. Okay, so you'll notice that now our warning here has disappeared. Okay, so here's this java.comment. Now check out what it becomes. Right, so you can see that the sort of summary string here happens there, and it sort of fills out this documentation pretty nicely, just with this comment. So you notice that I'm not giving the author and the since tags. You generally don't do that in sort of lower level methods. So anyways, just so you know. Okay, let's write this function. So first we're going to create our old friend the scanner object. But this time we're not going to read in from the user, we're going to read from our file. And before we do that, actually, so we're going to create the scanner. We're also going to create a file, and I'm going to call it this infile or inf, new file path. Okay, so this is basically opening a connection to this file here, and then from that, we're going to create our scanner. Now we're going to do this a little bit differently because it's possible that that this file doesn't exist. Just maybe we put in the wrong file name here, or some other error, or for some reason the operating system can't get to it at this time point. So we have to open, when we open this connection, with our scanner, we have to put it in a try-catch setting. So like this, new, oops. And basically, the reason we have to do this is because when we call this, when we call this code, if this is not, if something happens, if our connection to our file is wrong, this part of the code is going to throw an exception, or basically throw an error. But we want our program to sort of handle that gracefully and not just come to a crashing halt. So we put it in this, we're going to try to do this, and if we get an exception, for example, a file not found exception, which we're going to call E, then we're going to print some stuff out. And we're going to exit our program, and we're going to exit with status 1, which usually means like error, or usually exit status 0 means success. And Java does that automatically. That's why we don't have it in our code up here. Okay, but basically, if we get to this point right here, that means that we've tried this and it's worked. So we skip this catch part and we just move straight on to the rest of our code. So we're going to assume that that works, and usually it does. So we're going to do an initial. Right, so we have this file. Well, the first thing we need to do is figure out just how many lines the file is. So in order to do that, we just do an initial scan through the file. All we're doing is just counting the lines. We're going to make a variable to hold that number. And notice here we're going to use a for loop without any initialization. And the reason we don't put this numLines in the initialization is because we want to use it after the for loop. Anything that's initialized right here basically becomes out of scope as soon as the for loop exits, and thus gets destroyed by Java, basically. We're going to use this method called hasNextLine, and we're going to include numLines ++. So every time we have a next line, we're going to increase the number of lines that we have, and we're just going to sort of gobble up the next line in the body of the loop. Very simple loop. Okay, so once we get here, we're going to have a number of lines, and that's going to tell us basically how many lines we have in our file. Okay, and let's close it. So now, basically, now that we know how many lines we have, we're just going to do the exact same thing, but this time read them in for real. Okay, so again, the reason we needed to know how many lines were in our file is we needed to be able to initialize our string array of possible pals with a given number to a given length. This is because we're using an array here that requires us to basically specify a block of memory to initialize this array. And we need to know how big of a block of memory to use, which involves basically how big do we want our array to be. Anytime you're initializing an array, you have to know its length. Okay, so let's read in let's read in our lines now. All right, so that looks good, and now notice we're not complaining anymore. So okay, so we have this part of the function, and in general, and even though we haven't fleshed out this part, let's just comment this out and test and make sure that things seem to be working, the reading in seems to be working okay. All right, because you rarely do you write an entire program and test the whole thing all at once. Usually you test it in little bits and pieces. It makes it much easier to find where the problems are. So we're going to run it. Okay, so it looks like we are successfully reading in from our file. You'll see that these strings are the same, and obviously if I make this wider. Okay, so that looks good. That hopefully wasn't too hard. But yeah, it looks like we're reading it from our file successfully, and that's good. A common error that you might get with arrays is you accidentally have one more line than you actually have, and so, or you have one fewer, and so your array isn't quite the right size, and you don't read everything in. So this is why it's sometimes good just to test this kind of thing. Okay, so let's move on to what is frankly the harder part of the program, which is this palindrome function method, excuse me. And actually, one thing we can do is use in Eclipse is use code folding. So we have that, and we're just going to fold it so it's it's sort of out of the way. Okay, so next method. Again, it's going to be a private static. Function is going to be Boolean, which means it returns either a true or a false value. And we're going to pass into it a possible palindrome. Okay, and let's make our Java doc comment. And here, let's just specify ignoring white space capitalization, and punctuation. Okay, so because we're going to ignore all that stuff, we have to basically remove that from our string here. So normalize string. Okay. So we're going to take pospal, and we're going to make it all lowercase. You'll see there's a function called toLowercase. Okay. Now we're also going to use regular expressions, which we haven't talked about yet, but it would definitely behoove you to learn about them because they are incredibly powerful. And we're going to replace, now we could do this one by one, but with regular expressions, we're going to do it all at once. Okay, so regular expressions are basically a way for us to do really advanced string and pattern matching within strings, and I'll let you read up about them, and I'll link to a few cheat sheets and stuff on the blog. But for now, it'll suffice just to put in the thing that we're searching for. So basically, I'm going to search for all spaces, and this character right here, this vertical bar, just means or. So we're going to search for a space, or we're going to search for a colon, or a semicolon, or a period, and basically these things escape this period, because if we just have the period, it means a wildcard or any character, comma, and an apostrophe. Okay. Now, since we're getting over our 80 characters, let's bring this down. Okay. And what we're going to do is basically, if we find any one of these characters, space, colon, semicolon, period, comma, apostrophe, we're going to replace it with an empty string, meaning we're basically going to remove it. Okay? Now, we're going to, now what we need to do basically is test the sort of the first character against the last character, the second character against the second to last character, and sort of moving our way in. So we're gonna make two indices that allow us to do that. We're gonna start at 0, and our end index is going to be Palindrome dot length -1, right? That's that length -1. That's the last valid index. Okay. So now let's just check each pair of characters at the beginning and end. Okay. Again, we're going to use a for loop without any initialization in here, just because we want to use the other two parts, namely the place in here where we check a condition and the place here where we do some increment. So while our start index is less than or equal to our end index, okay, and we're going to start index plus plus. So after each loop, we're going to increment our start index. We're going to decrement our index. Now, you may not have known that you can actually put multiple statements in here separated by commas, but you can. Pretty handy. You don't want to put too much in here. You know, in theory, you could put a lot of stuff in here. Usually what you just keep it for sort of incrementing counters and things like that. Okay, so let's do our test. So basically, we want to test if Palindrome, if the character at Palindrome for our start index does not equal that for our end index, okay, then we're going to return false. Oops. Basically, we're going to test whether or not these characters are the same. If they're not the same, we're going to return false. So that means that if we basically get to the end of the loop and we haven't already returned from this method, then we're good. All right, so that should do it. So let's try it out. Okay, so what do we have here? So never odd or even is saying this is a palindrome, and you'll notice that it's basically removing, it's lowercasing this and removing all the spaces. If you want to test this out, just in your own program, just print out, each time you're processing this or processing this string, print it out. And notice we're calling this is palindrome for every single one of these strings. We only have to write the code once, which is really handy. And it's really nice to have this code sort of separate apart, so it makes this code right here where we're using it nice and clean. So obviously I just put this in here because I needed some stuff that wasn't a palindrome, and it's saying it's finding that it's not. And here, this is a cool one because we see that it's a pretty long string, but it is actually a palindrome if you read it backwards, and on and on. So here, this is our first project where we've done some regular expressions, which are very powerful, where we have split our code into different methods. So we're sort of getting into more and more complex projects, and that requires more and more sophisticated coding. So that's it for today, and good luck in your future projects.